Rome, one was noble, proud and grand. I watched you rise from the fearless sand. But now I see your pillars fall, betrayed by those who heed no call. Senators once wise, now blind with greed, turning from the common need. Liberty's light fades in the night as tyranny takes her flight.
Salve, dear traveller. I am Marcus Tullius Cicero, a man who lived and breathed the air of the Roman Republic, a citizen who, in his lifetime, witnessed the crumbling of the very foundations upon which our great republic stood. I was born in 106 BC, in Arpinum, a humble town far from the glories of Rome. Yet destiny drew me to the heart of our republic, where I became a senator, a consul, and above all, a defender of our ancient liberties. My life was a relentless pursuit of justice, virtue, and the preservation of our beloved republic, which I saw teetering on the brink of ruin. It is with a heavy heart, yet a determined spirit, that I recount the story of Rome, from its mythic origins to the tragic end of the republic under the shadow of Julius Caesar. Why do I, Cicero, choose to retell this tale? Because history, when forgotten, has a cruel tendency to repeat itself. Let this narrative serve as a warning to you, to posterity, and to all who cherish the ideals of liberty and justice. The tale of Rome's rise and fall is not merely a story of ancient times, but a mirror reflecting the dangers that still lurk in the hearts of men who lust for power. Let us begin our journey at the very inception of Rome, a city that rose from the ashes of violence and strife, built by the hands of outcasts and criminals, and yet destined to become the greatest power the world had ever seen. Through this story, I shall interject my thoughts, my fears, and my hopes as we explore the grandeur and the downfall of our republic. It is a tale of ambition, conflict, and ultimately, the duplicity that brought Rome to its knees. So, come with me, dear traveler, through time as we embark on this journey. Remember, history has not died, only our understanding of it. Ah, the origins of our beloved Roma tale woven from the fabric of myth and legend. The story of Romulus and Remus, twins born of Mars, the god of war, and Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin, is as much a foundation myth as it is a reflection of Rome's violent birth. Abandoned as infants and left to perish, they were miraculously saved by a she-wolf who nursed them until they were discovered by a shepherd. These twins would grow to become the founders of Rome, but not without bloodshed. Romulus, in a fit of rage or perhaps destiny, killed his brother Remus and established the city on the Palatine Hill in 753 BC. But what kind of city was Rome at its birth? It was a haven for outcasts, exiles, and criminals, those whom society had shunned. Romulus, recognizing the need for a population, opened Rome's doors to all, creating a city-state that was as much a refuge as it was a burgeoning power. It was a place where the lowest could rise and the highest could fall, a city built on the idea that strength and cunning could overcome birthright. The early Romans were not alone in Italy. They lived among the Etruscans, a sophisticated people to the north, whose culture and engineering would profoundly influence Rome. From the Etruscans, we learned the arts of statecraft, religion, and warfare. Yet, even in these early days, the seeds of conflict were sown. Rome was a land of division between the patricians, the aristocratic class who claimed descent from the original senators appointed by Romulus, and the plebeians, the common folk who formed the backbone of the city. This division was more than social, it was political. The patricians held the reins of power, while the plebeians struggled for a voice in the governance of their own city. They could not vote, they had no representation, and yet they served in the army, paid taxes, and built the city. This imbalance would lead to the first of many conflicts that would shape Rome's destiny, a struggle that, as we shall see, echoes through the ages. Even now, as I recount this, I see the parallels between our early republic and the struggles that led to its fall. The concentration of power, the disenfranchisement of the many, and the rise of charismatic leaders who promised change but brought only destruction. These are not new dangers. They are as old as Rome itself. Let us proceed, for the foundation of Rome, like its fall, is but the beginning of a much larger story. The fall of the Roman kingship and the rise of the Republic is a tale both exhilarating and ominous, a story of liberation, yes, but also a prelude to the conflicts that would one day bring Rome to its knees. In 509 BC, the Roman people, weary of tyranny, rose up against their last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. This was a man who, in his arrogance and cruelty, believed that he could rule Rome by fear alone. But fear is a double-edged sword, and in Tarquin's case, it cut him down. The catalyst for this rebellion was the tragic story of Lucretia, a noblewoman of unparalleled virtue, who was dishonored by Tarquin's son. Unable to bear the shame, she took her own life, an act that sparked outrage among the Roman populace. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, the Romans expelled Tarquin and his family, declaring that never again would a king rule over Rome. Thus was born the Roman Republic, a government not of kings, but of laws, a republic where the power of the state was to be shared among its citizens, where magistrates would be elected annually, and where the Senate, composed of Rome's most esteemed men, would guide the Republic through its many challenges. Yet the Republic's birth was not without its own duplicities. The power, once held by a single tyrant, was now in the hands of a select few, the patricians. These aristocrats wielded their authority with a grip as tight as any king's. The consuls, who replaced the kings, were always from their ranks, and though their power was checked by annual elections, their influence was pervasive. The Senate, too, was a body of patricians who believed themselves to be the true guardians of Rome, often placing their interests above those of the Republic. But Rome's story is one of constant struggle between freedom and tyranny, between the few and the many. The plebeians, the common citizens, had gained little in this transition. The Republic, which was supposed to be a government of the people, was instead a government of the elite. The plebeians had no real representation, no voice in the Senate, and no power to influence the laws that governed their lives. This was a recipe for conflict, and it would not take long for the tensions between the classes to erupt. I, Cicero, who have lived through the dying days of the Republic, cannot help but see in its birth the seeds of its eventual destruction, the same concentration of power, the same exclusion of the many, the same belief in the invincibility of the state. These were the very things that led to the Republic's fall. And yet, in those early days, there was hope, a belief that Rome could be different, that it could be a republic of laws, not of men. So let us move forward to the first great struggle between the classes, a struggle that would shape the future of Rome and set the stage for the Republic's ultimate fate. For in the story of Rome, as in the story of any great nation, the fight for justice and equality is never truly over. It is a battle that must be fought anew in every generation, lest the Republic become a tyranny in all but name. The plebeians had endured much since the founding of the Republic. While they toiled, fought, and died for Rome, their voices remained unheard in the corridors of power. By 494 BC, the frustration had reached a boiling point. The plebeians, fed up with their lack of political representation and the heavy debts that burdened them, took a drastic step. They seceded from Rome. The plebeians withdrew to the Sacred Mount just outside the city in what became known as the First Secession of the Plebs. This was no mere protest. It was a full-fledged strike against the very system that oppressed them. Without the plebeians, Rome's army was crippled, its economy stalled, and the city itself was left vulnerable. The message was clear. Without the plebeians, there could be no Rome. This bold act forced the patricians to negotiate. They realized that their power, though vast, was not absolute. A compromise was reached, one that would change the political landscape of Rome forever. The plebeians were granted the right to elect their own officials, the tribunes of the plebs. These tribunes had the power to protect the plebeians from the injustices of the patrician magistrates, and they could veto any law or decree that threatened their interests. The creation of the tribunate was a significant victory for the plebeians, but it was also a turning point for the Republic. The tribunes, though intended to be the protectors of the people, would eventually become powerful political figures in their own right, capable of challenging the authority of the Senate and the consuls. This new balance of power introduced a dynamic tension into the Roman political system, one that would both strengthen and, ultimately, weaken the Republic. As I reflect on this moment, I see the echoes of my own time, where the struggle between different factions threatened to tear the Republic apart. The plebeians' fight for justice was a noble one, but it also set in motion the very forces that would lead to the rise of populist leaders, men who would use the people's grievances to amass power for themselves. In seeking to protect the Republic, the plebeians unwittingly laid the groundwork for its downfall. But such is the nature of power. It is never static, always shifting, always seeking a new balance. The story of the first secession of the plebs is a reminder that the fight for justice is never without consequence, and that even the most righteous cause can be co-opted by those who seek power for its own sake. Let us continue, then, to the next chapter in our tale, where Rome's commitment to justice would be tested once again, this time through the codification of its laws, a momentous event that would define the Republic for centuries to come. The Republic, though established in law, was still young and fragile, and the tensions between the patricians and plebeians simmered just beneath the surface. The plebeians, having won the right to their own tribunes, now demanded something more fundamental: the rule of law. For too long, the patricians had manipulated Rome's unwritten customs to their advantage, meting out justice as it suited them. The plebeians, seeking fairness, clamored for a clear and public code of laws that would bind both rich and poor, patrician and plebeian alike. In 451 BC, the Senate, bowing to the pressure of the people, appointed a commission of 10 men, the decemviri, to draft a set of laws that would serve as the foundation of the Republic. These men were given extraordinary powers, even replacing the consuls for a time, to carry out this crucial task. The result was the 12 Tables, a code that would become the cornerstone of Roman law and a model for legal systems throughout history. The 12 Tables were inscribed on bronze tablets and displayed in the Forum for all to see, a symbol of transparency and justice. These laws covered a wide range of matters: property rights, debt, family law, and even religious practices. They were simple yet profound, capturing the essence of Roman life and the values that underpinned the Republic. For the plebeians, the 12 Tables represented a victory, a guarantee that the law was no longer the exclusive domain of the patricians, but a common framework that all Romans were bound to respect. Yet, as I recount this, I cannot help but reflect on the limitations of this achievement. The 12 Tables, while a monumental step forward, were still rooted in the social hierarchies of the time. They codified distinctions between the classes, with harsher penalties often reserved for the plebeians. They also enshrined the authority of the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, over his family, reinforcing the patriarchal structure of Roman society. The decemviri themselves, initially seen as impartial lawgivers, soon revealed their true nature. In their second year of office, they refused to step down, clinging to their power with the same tenacity as the kings of old. Their reign became tyrannical, culminating in the scandalous abuse of a young plebeian woman, Virginia, by Appius Claudius, the most powerful of the decemviri. This act of injustice sparked outrage, leading to the downfall of the decemviri and the restoration of the consular government. The story of the 12 Tables is a reminder of the complexity of progress. The plebeians had sought justice and equality, and in many ways they achieved it. But in doing so, they also encountered the reality that the law, even when codified, is not immune to the ambitions and corruptions of men. The 12 tables brought order to the Republic, but they also revealed the fragility of that order, dependent as it was on the integrity of those who enforced the laws. As we move forward, let us remember that the law, while necessary for the functioning of a republic, is not sufficient on its own. It must be coupled with virtue, with a commitment to the common good, and with vigilance against those who would twist it to their own ends. The 12 tables were a foundation, but like all foundations, they were only as strong as the society that rested upon them. Next, we shall delve into a darker chapter in Rome's history. The sack of the city by the Gauls, a moment of great crisis that tested the resilience of the Republic and its people. This was a time when Rome was brought to its knees, yet it was also a moment that forged the steel of Roman resolve. The year 390 BC marked a dark and harrowing chapter in the history of Rome, a moment when the Eternal City, which had grown in power and prestige, was brought to the brink of utter destruction by a foe from the north. The Gauls, a fierce and warlike people, descended upon Rome with a ferocity that the city had never before encountered. This invasion was not merely a battle, it was a catastrophe that shook the very foundations of the Republic. The Gauls, led by their chieftain Brennus, had come from the region we now know as France, sweeping across the Italian peninsula with little resistance. The Romans, confident in their military prowess, met them on the battlefield at the river Allia, but that confidence proved to be their undoing. The Roman army, poorly led and ill-prepared, was swiftly and brutally defeated. Panic spread like wildfire, and the survivors fled back to Rome, leaving the city vulnerable to the advancing enemy. As the Gauls approached, the people of Rome were gripped by fear. Many fled, seeking refuge in the countryside, while others sought sanctuary on the Capitoline Hill, the city's last bastion of defense. The Gauls entered Rome unopposed, their warriors fanning out across the city, looting, burning, and slaughtering at will. It is said that the flames consumed much of Rome, leaving behind a smoldering ruin that seemed to signal the end of the Republic. Yet, even in this darkest hour, there were glimmers of Roman resilience. On the Capitoline, the defenders held out against the Gauls, refusing to surrender despite their dire circumstances. According to legend, when the Gauls attempted a surprise assault on the hill, they were thwarted by the sacred geese of Juno, whose loud honking alerted the Romans to the impending attack. This divine intervention, whether fact or fiction, became a symbol of Rome's indomitable spirit. The siege dragged on and both sides grew weary. Brennus, realizing that his army could not break the Roman resolve, demanded a ransom of 1,000 pounds of gold in exchange for sparing the city. The Romans, desperate to save what little remained of their city, agreed. But as the gold was being weighed, Brennus treacherously added his sword to the scale, tipping it in his favor and declaring, "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished. This act of betrayal has echoed through the ages, a reminder of the harsh realities of power and conquest. The Romans, however, did not submit to this humiliation lightly. According to some accounts, the hero Camillus, who had been exiled but was called back in this time of crisis, arrived with a fresh army and drove the Gauls from the city, refusing to pay the ransom. Whether or not this tale is true, it became a powerful part of Rome's mythology, representing the triumph of Roman virtue over barbarian treachery. As I reflect on this event, I see in it a turning point for Rome. The sack of the city by the Gauls was a devastating blow, yet it also forged a new determination in the Roman people. They rebuilt their city with greater fortifications, strengthened their army, and vowed never to allow such a disaster to befall them again. This was a lesson learned in blood and fire, a lesson that would shape the future of Rome. But I also see in this episode a warning to all who grow complacent in their power. Rome, in its pride, had underestimated the Gauls, believing itself invincible. It was this hubris that nearly led to its destruction. In the Republic's later years, I witnessed a similar arrogance, a belief that Rome was destined to rule the world, invulnerable to any threat. But power, as the Gauls demonstrated, is always fragile. always subject to the forces of fate and the ambitions of men. As we move forward in our tale, let us remember that the strength of a republic lies not in its walls or its armies, but in the spirit of its people, their courage, their resolve, and their commitment to the common good. Next, we shall explore the Samnite Wars, a series of conflicts that would test Rome's military might and its ability to forge alliances as the Republic sought to expand its influence across Italy. These wars would set the stage for Rome's rise as a dominant power, but also reveal the internal strains that would one day tear it apart. In the annals of Rome's history, the Samnite Wars stand as a crucial chapter, where the Republic, though young and still finding its footing, began to assert its dominance over the Italian peninsula. These wars, fought against the formidable Samnites, were not merely battles for territory, but for the soul of Rome itself, its identity, its values, and its place in the world. The struggle was long and arduous, spanning over half a century, and it would shape the Republic in ways that even the most far-seeing of us could scarcely have imagined. The Samnites were a proud and warlike people dwelling in the rugged mountains of central Italy. Their lands were rich in resources, and they were skilled in the arts of war. They were not a foe to be taken lightly, and the Romans quickly learned that this was no ordinary enemy. The First Samnite War, 343–341 BC, began as a conflict over the control of the fertile Campanian plain. Rome, driven by its growing ambition and the need to secure its borders, intervened on behalf of its allies in Capua, who were threatened by the Samnites. The war ended with a Roman victory, but it was only a prelude to the greater struggles that lay ahead. The Second Samnite War, from 326 to 304 BC, was the true crucible of Rome's military might. This was a conflict marked by both glory and despair, where Rome's legions were tested to their limits. The war began over disputes in the city of Neapolis, but it quickly escalated into a full-scale struggle for supremacy in Italy. The Samnites, fighting on their home turf, inflicted one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history, the Battle of the Caudine Forks in 321 BC. Here, the Roman army was trapped in a mountain pass, forced to surrender, and subjected to the disgrace of passing under the yoke, a symbolic gesture of submission. This defeat could have broken a lesser people, but for the Romans, it only strengthened their resolve. They reformed their armies, adapted their strategies, and slowly turned the tide against the Samnites. The war dragged on for years, with victories and losses on both sides, but eventually, Rome's persistence paid off. The Samnites were forced to sue for peace, and Rome emerged as the dominant power in central Italy. The Third Samnite War, from 298 to 290 BC, was the final decisive confrontation. The Samnites, desperate to resist Roman expansion, formed a coalition with other Italian tribes, including the Etruscans and the Gauls. This was a moment of great peril for Rome, as it faced enemies on multiple fronts. Yet the Romans, with their characteristic tenacity, met this challenge head-on. The Battle of Sentinum in 295 BC was the turning point, where Rome's legions, under the command of the consuls Decius Mus and Fabius Rullianus, decisively defeated the coalition forces. The victory was hard-fought, with Decius Mus famously sacrificing himself in a devotio, a ritual act of self-sacrifice to the gods to ensure the success of his troops. With the end of the Samnite Wars, Rome had secured its dominance over the Italian peninsula. The Samnites were not destroyed, but their power was broken, and they were absorbed into the Roman state as allies. This victory marked the beginning of Rome's transformation from a regional power into a force that would eventually dominate the Mediterranean world. But what was the cost of this expansion? As I reflect on these wars, I see a pattern that would repeat itself throughout Roman history. With each victory, Rome grew stronger, but it also grew more ambitious, more willing to use its military might to achieve its ends. The Republic, once a small city-state with modest ambitions, was becoming an empire in all but name. And with that empire came new challenges: how to govern vast territories, how to manage the diversity of its peoples, and how to maintain the unity of the Republic in the face of growing inequality and internal strife. The Samnite Wars were a test of Rome's resilience, but they also sowed the seeds of future conflicts. The Republic had proven its strength, but it was also setting itself on a path that would lead to greater conquests and greater dangers. As we move forward in our story, we will see how Rome's victories, while bringing glory and power, also brought new challenges that would strain the very fabric of the Republic. Next, we shall turn our attention to the Punic Wars, where Rome's ambitions would reach across the seas to challenge the might of Carthage, a rival empire that threatened to overshadow the Republic's growing power. These wars would not only test Rome's military prowess, but also its ability to sustain a long and costly conflict, one that would push the Republic to the brink. If the Samnite Wars marked the rise of Rome in Italy, then the Punic Wars heralded its emergence as a true power on the world stage. The First Punic War, fought between Rome and Carthage, was the opening salvo in a titanic struggle that would determine the fate of the Western Mediterranean. This war, which began over a conflict in Sicily, was far more than a battle for a single island. It was a clash of civilizations: Rome, the rising republic of disciplined legions, and Carthage, the mighty maritime empire with its vast wealth and powerful navy. The roots of the conflict lay in the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized the Mediterranean world. Sicily, lying between Italy and North Africa, was a prize coveted by both powers. When the city of Messana, controlled by the Mamertines, a band of Italian mercenaries, appealed to Rome for help against the Carthaginians, the Senate saw an opportunity to expand Roman influence. Rome's decision to intervene set the stage for a conflict that neither side could have predicted would last more than 2 decades. At the outset, Rome faced a significant disadvantage. The Republic had no real navy to speak of, while Carthage was the preeminent sea power of the time, its ships dominating the Mediterranean. But the Romans, with their characteristic ingenuity and determination, swiftly adapted. They constructed a fleet from scratch, basing their design on a captured Carthaginian ship, and introduced the corvus, a boarding device that allowed them to turn naval battles into infantry engagements, where their legions excelled. The war saw fierce and costly battles, both on land and at sea. Rome's new fleet scored a significant victory at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC, where the consul Gaius Duilius defeated the Carthaginian navy using the corvus to great effect. This victory was a turning point, proving that Rome could challenge Carthage's naval supremacy. However, the war was far from decided. Carthage, with its vast resources and skilled mercenaries, continued to resist fiercely, and the conflict dragged on, sapping the strength of both sides. One of the most remarkable aspects of the First Punic War was the sheer scale of the losses. The war saw multiple naval disasters, where entire fleets were lost to storms or sunk in battle. The Battle of Ecnomus in 256 BC, one of the largest naval engagements in history, ended with another Roman victory, but at a tremendous cost. Thousands of lives were lost, and the war seemed no closer to a resolution. On land, the Romans faced equally daunting challenges. The campaign in Africa, initially promising, turned into a disaster when the Roman army was defeated and forced to surrender at the Battle of Tunis in 255 BC. The Carthaginians, under the leadership of the brilliant general Hamilcar Barca, father of the famous Hannibal, waged a relentless guerrilla campaign that kept the Romans at bay. But Rome's greatest strength was its perseverance. Despite setbacks and defeats, the Republic refused to give up. The war finally turned in Rome's favor with the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BC, where the Roman navy, rebuilt and resupplied, dealt a decisive blow to the Carthaginian fleet. Unable to continue the fight, Carthage sued for peace. The Treaty of Lutatius, which ended the war, was harsh on Carthage. They were forced to surrender Sicily, pay a massive indemnity, and limit their naval power. Rome, victorious but exhausted, had established itself as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean, with Sicily becoming its first province outside the Italian peninsula. As I reflect on the First Punic War, I see it as a moment of profound transformation for Rome. The Republic had not only proven its military might, but had also begun its evolution into an imperial power. The war had been costly, but it had forged a new Roman identity, one that saw itself as destined to rule, not just Italy, but the world. But with power came new responsibilities and new dangers. The war had strained the resources of the Republic, and the victory, while glorious, left Rome with new territories to govern and new enemies to face. The seeds of future conflicts were sown in the ashes of Carthage's defeat, as Rome's ambitions grew ever larger, and the Republic began to grapple with the challenges of managing an expanding empire. Next, we shall turn to the Second Punic War, where the indomitable spirit of Rome would be tested like never before by Hannibal Barca, a man who would become one of Rome's greatest adversaries and whose name would strike fear into the heart of every Roman. This war would not only be a test of military strength, but also of the resilience of the Republic itself, as it faced one of the greatest crises in its history. The Second Punic War was not merely a conflict, it was an epic, a saga that would see Rome brought to the brink of annihilation by one of the greatest military geniuses the world has ever known, Hannibal Barca. This war, more than any other in the Republic's history, tested the limits of Roman courage, strategy, and endurance. The name Hannibal still echoes in the annals of time, a symbol of both the might of Carthage and the indomitable spirit of Rome. The origins of this conflict lay in the simmering resentment of Carthage following its defeat in the First Punic War. Stripped of its territories in Sicily and burdened with a crushing indemnity, Carthage turned its gaze to the rich lands of Spain to rebuild its fortunes. It was here that young Hannibal, son of Hamilcar Barca, was raised in a culture of intense hatred for Rome. It is said that as a child, Hannibal swore an oath of eternal enmity against Rome, a vow that he would honor with devastating effect. The spark for war was lit in the Spanish city of Saguntum, a Roman ally south of the Ebro River, the agreed-upon boundary between Roman and Carthaginian influence. When Hannibal besieged and captured Saguntum in 219 BC, Rome issued an ultimatum. Hannibal, ever defiant, ignored it, and thus the stage was set for one of history's greatest confrontations. Hannibal's strategy was audacious and unprecedented. Rather than waiting for Rome to bring the fight to him, he took the war to Italy itself. In one of the most remarkable feats of military history, Hannibal led his army, including war elephants, across the Alps, a journey fraught with peril, where the Carthaginians faced treacherous terrain, hostile tribes, and severe weather. When Hannibal finally descended into Italy, he did so with an army diminished in numbers but steeled in resolve. Rome, confident in its legions, marched out to meet this foreign invader, but what followed was a series of stunning defeats that shook the Republic to its core. At the Battle of the Trebia in 218 BC, the Romans were lured into a trap and decisively beaten. The following year, at Lake Trasimene, Hannibal executed one of the most brilliant ambushes in military history, annihilating a Roman army in the fog-shrouded hills. But it was in 216 BC, at the Battle of Cannae, that Hannibal delivered his most crushing blow. Here, he employed a double envelopment, encircling and destroying a Roman force nearly twice the size of his own. It was a massacre. Tens of thousands of Romans were killed or captured, and the Republic was left reeling. The defeat at Cannae was so severe that Rome's allies began to waver, and for a moment, it seemed as if the Republic might fall. Yet in the face of this calamity, Rome did not surrender. It is here that the true character of the Republic was revealed, not in its victories, but in its resilience. Rome refused to negotiate with Hannibal. Instead, raising new armies and adopting a strategy of attrition. The Roman general Fabius Maximus, dubbed Cunctator, the delayer, avoided direct confrontations with Hannibal, instead harassing his forces and cutting off his supply lines. Though criticized by some for his caution, Fabius's strategy bought Rome the time it needed to recover. Hannibal, despite his brilliance on the battlefield, was never able to capitalize on his victories. His pleas for reinforcements from Carthage went unanswered, and he found himself increasingly isolated in a hostile land. Rome, meanwhile, began to turn the tide, recapturing cities that had defected and defeating Carthaginian forces in Spain and Sicily. The war's climax came in 202 BC, at the Battle of Zama in North Africa. Here, the Roman general Scipio Africanus, who had studied Hannibal's tactics and learned from Rome's earlier defeats, faced the Carthaginian leader in a final showdown. In a bitterly contested battle, Scipio outmaneuvered Hannibal, leading to a decisive Roman victory. Carthage, exhausted and defeated, sued for peace, marking the end of the Second Punic War. The consequences of this war were profound. Rome emerged as the unchallenged master of the Western Mediterranean, with Carthage reduced to a shadow of its former self, forced to pay another indemnity and stripped of its navy and overseas territories. Hannibal, the great enemy of Rome, fled into exile, living out his days as a fugitive until he took his own life rather than fall into Roman hands. But the true legacy of the Second Punic War was the transformation of Rome itself. The Republic had survived its greatest test, but it had been forever changed. The war had demanded extraordinary sacrifices from its citizens, had seen the rise of new military leaders who would later challenge the authority of the Senate, and had set Rome on a path of expansion and conquest that would eventually lead to the Republic's own undoing. As I, Marcus Tullius Cicero, reflect on the lessons of this war, I see in it both the glory and the peril of the Republic. Hannibal's campaign was a reminder of the dangers of hubris, the ever-present threat of overreach, and the importance of unity and resilience in the face of adversity. Yet, I also see the seeds of future conflicts, the rise of military commanders with personal armies, the strain on Rome's resources, and the growing inequality that would lead to social unrest. Next, we shall delve into the Third Punic War, a conflict that would see Rome complete its destruction of Carthage, erasing its greatest rival from the map and solidifying its dominance. But even as Rome reached the height of its power, the cracks in the Republic would begin to widen, leading inexorably to the struggles and civil wars that would ultimately bring about its fall. The Third Punic War, though brief compared to its predecessors, was an event of profound consequence for Rome and the Mediterranean world. This conflict, driven by a mixture of fear, greed, and a thirst for vengeance, culminated in the complete and utter destruction of Carthage. The war was, in many ways, the final chapter in a story that had begun over a century earlier, when Rome and Carthage first crossed swords. It was a war that would leave Rome the unchallenged master of the Western Mediterranean, but at what cost to its soul? After the Second Punic War, Carthage had been reduced to a state of enforced impotence. It was forbidden from waging war without Rome's permission, and its once mighty navy had been dismantled. Yet, despite these restrictions, Carthage managed to recover economically, rebuilding its wealth through trade and agriculture. This resurgence, however, was viewed with suspicion and alarm by many in Rome. The memory of Hannibal's near conquest of the Republic still haunted the Roman imagination, and there were those who believed that as long as Carthage existed, it would remain a threat. Among these voices was Marcus Porcius Cato, known to history as Cato the Elder. A staunch traditionalist and fierce advocate of Roman supremacy, Cato ended every speech in the Senate, regardless of the topic, with the phrase, "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. To Cato and others like him, Carthage was a cancer that needed to be excised completely, lest it one day rise again to challenge Rome. This relentless agitation for war found fertile ground in a Rome that was increasingly aggressive and imperialistic. The pretext for the final conflict came when Carthage, threatened by the neighboring Numidian king Massinissa, a Roman ally, decided to defend itself without seeking Rome's approval. This act of defiance was all the Senate needed to justify an invasion. In 149 BC, Rome declared war on Carthage, sending an army to Africa with the clear intention of erasing its old rival from the map. The Carthaginians, realizing too late the seriousness of their situation, made desperate attempts to placate Rome. They surrendered their weapons, their navy, and even their children as hostages. But when the Roman commanders demanded that the city itself be dismantled and its population relocated inland, the Carthaginians chose to resist. It was a decision born of desperation, but also of a deep-seated pride. Carthage, even in its weakened state, would not go quietly into oblivion. What followed was a grim and brutal siege that lasted 3 years. The Carthaginians, cut off from their allies and surrounded by a superior force, fought with remarkable tenacity. They fortified their city, repurposed buildings into makeshift weapons factories, and even armed their slaves in a last-ditch effort to defend their homes. The Roman forces, led by Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, faced a formidable challenge in breaking through the city's defenses. The climax of the war came in 146 BC when the Romans finally breached Carthage's walls. What followed was a week of horror as the city was systematically destroyed. The streets ran red with blood as the Romans slaughtered the inhabitants' men, women, and children alike. Those who survived were sold into slavery, and the city itself was razed to the ground. Legend has it that the Romans sowed the fields with salt to ensure that nothing would grow there again. Though this tale may be more symbolic than literal, what is certain is that Carthage was obliterated, its memory consigned to the ashes of history. The end of Carthage was celebrated in Rome as a great triumph, but it also marked a turning point, a moment when the Republic's expansionist ambitions began to eclipse its republican virtues. The destruction of Carthage removed the last significant check on Rome's power in the Western Mediterranean, leaving it free to pursue its imperial ambitions with little regard for the consequences. As I reflect on the Third Punic War, I cannot help but see it as a moment of both glory and tragedy. Rome had triumphed over its greatest rival, but in doing so, it had also set a dangerous precedent. The willingness to destroy a once great city, to wipe out an entire people, was a harbinger of the ruthlessness that would later come to define Roman imperialism. The Republic, which had once prided itself on its virtues and its respect for the rule of law, was beginning to lose its way. And yet, the destruction of Carthage was not merely an act of brute force. It was also a profound statement about the nature of power and the lengths to which a state will go to secure its survival. For Rome, Carthage had become a symbol of existential threat, and in erasing that symbol, the Republic believed it was ensuring its own future. But in reality, Rome had sown the seeds of its own destruction. The unchecked power and ambition that had led to the fall of Carthage would, in time, turn inward, tearing apart the very fabric of the Republic. Next, we shall turn our attention to the internal challenges that began to surface in the wake of Rome's conquests. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, would attempt to address the growing inequalities within Roman society through reforms, but their efforts would only deepen the divisions, leading to unrest and ultimately violence. The story of the Gracchi is a tragic one, and it serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of ignoring the needs of the people in favor of the ambitions of the few. The story of the Gracchi brothers Tiberius and Gaius is one of the most poignant and tragic in the annals of Roman history. It is a tale of noble intentions, misguided efforts, and the deepening chasm between the rich and the poor that would eventually lead to the unraveling of the Roman Republic. The Gracchi sought to address the growing inequalities that plagued Rome, but in doing so, they ignited a fire that would consume them both and leave a legacy of division and violence. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, Rome had become the master of the Mediterranean. its territories stretching from Spain in the west to Greece and Asia Minor in the east. However, this vast expansion brought with it profound social and economic changes. The spoils of war and the influx of wealth had enriched the Roman elite, leading to the concentration of land and power in the hands of a few wealthy families. Meanwhile, the backbone of the Republic, the small farmers and plebeians, found themselves increasingly dispossessed and marginalized. Into this volatile situation stepped Tiberius Gracchus, the elder of the two brothers. Born into one of Rome's most distinguished families, Tiberius was a grandson of Scipio Africanus, the hero of the Second Punic War. Yet, despite his aristocratic pedigree, Tiberius was deeply concerned with the plight of the common people. He saw how the latifundia, large estates owned by the wealthy and worked by slaves, were driving small farmers off their land, leaving them destitute and swelling the ranks of the urban poor. In 133 BC, as a tribune of the Plebs, Tiberius proposed a radical land reform aimed at redistributing public land, ager publicus, to the landless citizens of Rome. His Lex Sempronia Agraria sought to limit the amount of public land that any one individual could hold and to redistribute the excess to those in need. It was a bold and controversial proposal, one that struck at the heart of the entrenched interests of the Senate and the wealthy elite. Tiberius, however, underestimated the opposition he would face. His enemies in the Senate, led by the powerful landowners who stood to lose from the reform, accused him of seeking to undermine the Republic and establish himself as a tyrant. They used every means at their disposal to block his legislation, but Tiberius was resolute. When the Senate refused to fund his reforms, he bypassed them entirely, using the wealth of the recently deceased King Attalus III of Pergamum, which had been bequeathed to Rome. The situation reached a climax when Tiberius, seeking a second term as tribune, a move unprecedented and seen as a threat to the established order, was accused of plotting to make himself king. On the day of the election, violence erupted. Tiberius and his supporters were attacked by a group of senators and their clients, armed with clubs and stones. In the chaos, Tiberius was killed, his body thrown into the Tiber River, a fate unworthy of his noble lineage and his lofty ideals. But the death of Tiberius Gracchus did not end the movement he had started. His younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, took up the cause a decade later. Gaius was more astute and experienced than his brother, and he approached the task of reform with a broader agenda. As tribune in 123 BC, Gaius introduced a series of laws aimed at addressing not only land reform, but also other issues of inequality and corruption. These included measures to provide subsidized grain to the poor, improve the lot of the equestrian class, and establish new colonies for landless citizens. Gaius was a fiery orator and a charismatic leader, and he quickly gained the support of the people. But his reforms, like those of his brother, threatened the power of the Senate and the traditional elite. The Senate, led by Gaius's arch-enemy, Lucius Opimius, moved to undermine him. They passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a decree that granted the consul extraordinary powers to protect the state by any means necessary, a thinly veiled license to eliminate Gaius and his supporters. In 121 BC, tensions boiled over. Gaius, finding himself outmaneuvered and isolated, retreated to the Aventine Hill with a small group of loyal followers. There, surrounded by the forces of the consul, Gaius chose to take his own life rather than be captured. His death marked the end of the Gracchian reforms, but the seeds of division and strife they had sown would continue to grow. The tragedy of the Gracchi brothers lies not in their failure, but in the profound consequences of their efforts. They sought to address the very real problems of inequality and injustice in the Republic, but their methods and the fierce opposition they faced only deepened the divisions within Roman society. Their deaths marked a turning point in the history of the Republic, as political violence became increasingly common and the rule of law began to erode. As I, Marcus Tullius Cicero, contemplate the legacy of the Gracchi, I see in their story a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked power and the need for balance in governance. The Republic, which had once been a model of shared power and civic virtue, was beginning to fracture under the strain of its own success. The Gracchi's vision of a more equitable society was noble, but it was met with an intransigence and ruthlessness that would only worsen in the years to come. Next, we shall explore the military reforms of Gaius Marius, another figure who sought to reshape the Republic, but in doing so would lay the groundwork for the rise of the personal armies that would ultimately lead to civil war. The story of Marius is one of ambition, innovation, and the ever-present danger of power, concentrated in the hands of a single individual. The rise of Gaius Marius represents a pivotal moment in the history of the Roman Republic, a moment when the old ways of governance and military organization gave way to new forces that would forever alter the character of Rome. Marius was a man of humble origins, a novus homo, the first in his family to rise to the consulship. Yet, through his military brilliance and political acumen, he not only achieved the highest honors in the Republic, but also transformed the Roman army in ways that would have far-reaching consequences. By the late 2nd century BC, the Roman Republic was facing a series of crises that threatened its very existence. In the north, the Cimbri and Teutones, two powerful Germanic tribes, were wreaking havoc, defeating Roman legions and spreading fear throughout the Italian peninsula. In North Africa, the war against Jugurtha, the cunning king of Numidia, had dragged on for years with little success. The Republic's military machine, once the envy of the world, seemed to be faltering, and the Senate, paralyzed by internal divisions, was unable to provide effective leadership. Into this void stepped Gaius Marius. Born in the town of Arpinum, far from the political centers of Rome, Marius was a man of the people, untainted by the aristocratic privileges that so often bred complacency. He had made his name as a soldier, serving with distinction in Spain and later under the command of Scipio Aemilianus at the siege of Numantia. His rise to power was marked by a relentless drive and a willingness to challenge the established order, traits that would define his career. In 107 BC, Marius was elected consul for the first time, a remarkable achievement for a man of his background. He immediately set about reforming the Roman army. Recognizing that the traditional system of recruitment based on property ownership was no longer adequate to meet the demands of the Republic's expanding territories and constant warfare. The old legions had been composed of citizen soldiers, men who owned land and fought out of a sense of duty to the Republic. But with the decline of the small farmer and the rise of the large estates, the pool of eligible recruits had dwindled. Marius's solution was as revolutionary as it was pragmatic. He opened the ranks of the army to the capite censi, the poorest citizens who owned no property. These men, who had previously been excluded from military service, were now offered the chance to enlist in the legions. In return, they would receive pay, equipment, and, most importantly, the promise of land upon their discharge. The army, once a temporary duty for landowners, became a professional force, composed of full-time soldiers who were loyal not to the Senate or the Republic, but to their commander. This was the beginning of a profound shift in the nature of Roman military power. Marius's reforms created legions that were more disciplined, more cohesive, and more effective in battle. His troops were hardened by rigorous training and constant campaigning, and they were fiercely loyal to Marius, who had given them a chance at a better life. It was this army that Marius led to victory against Jugurtha, finally bringing the Numidian War to a close and capturing the elusive king. But it was in the campaigns against the Cimbri and Teutones that Marius truly cemented his legacy. After several humiliating defeats at the hands of these northern invaders, Marius was given command of the legions and tasked with defending Italy from this existential threat. Over several years, he reorganized and retrained the Roman forces, leading them to decisive victories at Aquae Sextiae in 102 BC and at Vercellae in 101 BC. The Germanic threat was eliminated, and Marius was hailed as the savior of Rome. honored with the unprecedented distinction of holding the consulship 7 times. Yet, the success of Marius came at a cost. His reforms, while necessary, laid the groundwork for the rise of personal armies, loyal not to the state, but to their generals. The soldiers who served under Marius were bound to him by ties of patronage and loyalty, not by allegiance to the Republic. This shift in loyalty would have devastating consequences in the years to come, as ambitious leaders like Sulla, Pompey, and eventually Julius Caesar would use their armies to seize power, leading to the breakdown of the republican system. As I reflect on the achievements of Gaius Marius, I cannot help but admire his skill as a military commander and his vision in recognizing the need for reform. Yet I also see in his actions the seeds of the Republic's decline. Marius was a man who rose from obscurity to greatness, but in doing so, he also set in motion forces that would ultimately lead to the Republic's downfall. His story is a reminder of the delicate balance that must be maintained between military power and civil authority, a balance that was increasingly tilted in favor of the former. Next, we will turn to the social war, a conflict that arose from the very inequalities and tensions that Marius's reforms had failed to address. The Italian allies, long denied the rights and privileges of Roman citizenship, would rise in rebellion, challenging the Republic and forcing it to confront the question of who truly belonged to the Roman state. The social war is a story of inclusion and exclusion, of unity and division, and its outcome would shape the future of Rome in profound ways. The social war, or bellum sociale as it was known, was a conflict that shook the foundations of the Roman Republic and forced it to confront the question of what it truly meant to be Roman. For decades, Rome's Italian allies, those who had fought alongside her in countless battles and had helped build her empire, had been treated as second-class citizens, denied the rights and privileges that came with Roman citizenship. This war, which erupted in 91 BC, was not merely a struggle for political power. It was a fight for recognition, dignity, and inclusion in the very fabric of the Roman state. The roots of the social war lay in the deepening divisions within the Republic, divisions exacerbated by Rome's expansion and the increasing concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few. The Italian allies, or socii, had long borne the burdens of military service, paying taxes and contributing to Rome's wars without reaping the full benefits of Roman citizenship. They had grown resentful of their exclusion from the political process and their lack of representation in the Senate. Despite their contributions, they were treated as subjects rather than equals, a situation that could not endure indefinitely. The catalyst for the conflict came in 91 BC, when Marcus Livius Drusus, a tribune of the Plebs, proposed a series of reforms aimed at addressing the grievances of the Italian allies. Drusus, a man of vision and courage, sought to extend Roman citizenship to all free Italians, thereby integrating them fully into the Republic. His proposal, however, was met with fierce opposition from the Senate and the Roman aristocracy, who feared the dilution of their power and the loss of their privileged status. Drusus's reforms were blocked, and he was assassinated, a clear message to those who would challenge the status quo. The murder of Drusus was the spark that ignited the social war. The Italian allies, led by the Marsi and Samnites, took up arms against Rome, forming a confederation with their own capital at Corfinium, which they renamed Italica. They demanded the rights that had been denied them for so long: full citizenship, representation in the Senate, and the ability to participate in the decisions that affected their lives. What had begun as a movement for reform now became a full-scale revolt, with the Italians determined to secure their rights by force if necessary. The war that followed was brutal and devastating. Both sides were seasoned fighters, and the conflict saw some of the bloodiest battles in Roman history. Rome, under the leadership of generals like Lucius Cornelius Sulla and Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, faced a formidable challenge. The Italians were not just fighting for power, they were fighting for their identity, for the right to be recognized as Romans. Despite early successes, the Italian allies were ultimately no match for the resources and military might of Rome. The tide of the war began to turn in Rome's favor when the Senate, realizing the futility of continued bloodshed, began to offer concessions. In 90 BC, the Lex Julia was passed, granting Roman citizenship to any Italian ally who laid down their arms. This was followed by the Lex Plautia Papiria in 89 BC, which extended citizenship to all Italians who applied within a certain time frame. These measures effectively undermined the rebellion, as more and more Italian communities accepted the offer of citizenship and withdrew from the conflict. By 88 BC, the social war was effectively over. The Italians had won a partial victory. They had gained the citizenship they so desperately sought, but at a tremendous cost. The war had left Italy devastated, with countless lives lost and communities shattered. The social and political fabric of the Republic had been irreparably damaged, and the extension of citizenship to the Italian allies, while necessary, only served to heighten tensions within Rome itself. The social war was a turning point in the history of the Roman Republic. It marked the end of the old order, in which Rome's allies were subservient to the city, and the beginning of a new, more inclusive republic. Yet this inclusivity came with its own challenges. The sudden influx of new citizens, many of whom were not fully integrated into Roman society, created new pressures on the political system. The Senate, already struggling to maintain its authority, now had to contend with a much larger and more diverse electorate. As I reflect on the social war, I am struck by the irony of its outcome. The Italian allies, in seeking to be part of the Roman Republic, helped to hasten its decline. The Republic, once a model of civic virtue and shared governance, was now increasingly divided, its institutions weakened by internal strife and the pressures of expansion. The social war, rather than strengthening the Republic, exposed its vulnerabilities and set the stage for the conflicts that would follow. Next, we will examine the rise of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man whose ambition and ruthlessness would bring the Republic to the brink of destruction. Sulla, who had distinguished himself as a general during the social war, would go on to seize power in Rome through force, becoming the first man in Roman history to march on the city with his army. His actions would set a dangerous precedent, one that would be followed by others, leading to the eventual fall of the Republic. The figure of Lucius Cornelius Sulla looms large in the annals of Roman history, a man whose ambition, ruthlessness, and contempt for republican norms marked the beginning of the end for the Roman Republic. Sulla, a patrician by birth and a brilliant military commander by training, emerged from the social war as one of Rome's most powerful men. Yet it was his relentless pursuit of personal power that would plunge Rome into civil war, tearing apart the very fabric of the state he claimed to defend. The seeds of Sulla's conflict with the Republic were sown in the aftermath of the social war. Rome, still reeling from the recent conflict, was now embroiled in a struggle against Mithridates VI of Pontus, a formidable and cunning adversary who threatened Rome's eastern provinces. The Senate, recognizing Sulla's military prowess, appointed him to command the legions against Mithridates. Yet this decision sparked a fierce rivalry with Gaius Marius, who coveted the command for himself. Marius, now an elder statesman but still a formidable political force, maneuvered to have the command transferred to him, using his influence with the popular assemblies to override the Senate's decision. Sulla, furious at this affront to his honor and authority, did the unthinkable. In 88 BC, he marched his legions on Rome, an unprecedented act of treason that shattered the long-standing tradition that no Roman general could bring his army within the sacred boundaries of the city. With his soldiers loyal to him rather than the state, Sulla seized control of Rome by force, driving Marius and his supporters into exile. This was the first time in Roman history that a general had used his army to seize power in the capital, setting a dangerous precedent that others would follow. With Rome under his control, Sulla set about consolidating his power. He declared himself dictator, not for the usual 6-month term, but indefinitely, a clear sign that he intended to rule without restraint. His reign of terror began with the infamous proscriptions lists of his enemies, both real and imagined, who were marked for death. These proscriptions were not just acts of vengeance, but also a means of enriching Sulla and his supporters, as the property of the condemned was confiscated and auctioned off. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Romans, including many of the Republic's leading citizens, were executed during this bloody purge. Sulla's dictatorship was not merely about personal power, it was also about reshaping the Republic to ensure that no one could challenge his authority. He implemented a series of constitutional reforms designed to strengthen the Senate's control over the state, while curbing the power of the popular assemblies and the tribunes of the plebs. These reforms were meant to restore the traditional republican order, but in reality, they only served to concentrate power in the hands of a narrow oligarchy, further alienating the lower classes and creating even deeper divisions within Roman society. Yet, for all his ruthlessness, Sulla's legacy is one of profound irony. After having reshaped the Republic to his liking, he did something utterly unexpected. He voluntarily resigned his dictatorship in 81 BC and retired to his villa in the countryside. It was an extraordinary act, one that has puzzled historians for centuries. Why would a man who had gone to such lengths to seize power willingly give it up? Perhaps Sulla believed that his reforms had secured the Republic's future, or perhaps he simply wished to enjoy the fruits of his labors in peace. Whatever his reasons, Sulla's retirement did little to stem the tide of violence and instability he had unleashed. The consequences of Sulla's actions were far-reaching and devastating. By marching on Rome, he had shown that military force could be used to settle political disputes, undermining the very foundations of the Republic. His proscriptions had sown fear and mistrust throughout the city, creating a culture of violence and retribution that would haunt Rome for decades to come. And his constitutional reforms, rather than stabilizing the Republic, had only exacerbated the tensions between the Senate and the popular assemblies, setting the stage for future conflicts. As I reflect on the life and legacy of Sulla, I am struck by the paradox of his character. Here was a man who claimed to be a defender of the Republic, yet whose actions did more to destroy it than any foreign enemy ever could. Sulla's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the corrosive effects of power. It is a reminder that the Republic, for all its strengths, was ultimately vulnerable to the very men who were sworn to protect it. Next, we will turn to one of the most dramatic and tragic episodes in Roman history, the slave revolt led by Spartacus. This uprising, which began in 73 BC, would challenge Rome's authority in ways that few could have imagined, revealing the deep-seated social and economic inequalities that plagued the Republic. Spartacus's rebellion, though ultimately doomed, would become a symbol of resistance against tyranny, a symbol that resonates to this day. In the year 73 BC, Rome faced an uprising unlike any it had ever seen, a revolt that shook the very foundations of its society and revealed the depths of its inequities. This was no ordinary rebellion of foreign enemies or political rivals. It was a revolt led by those whom Rome had deemed beneath notice, the slaves. And at the forefront of this uprising was a man whose name would echo through the ages, Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator who defied the might of Rome in a desperate struggle for freedom. The story of Spartacus is one of both tragedy and heroism, a tale that exposes the harsh realities of life for the enslaved and the oppressed in the Roman Republic. Born in Thrace, Spartacus had been captured by Roman soldiers and sold into slavery, eventually finding himself in a gladiatorial school in Capua. There, he was trained to fight and kill for the entertainment of Rome's citizens, a brutal existence that stripped men of their dignity and humanity. Yet Spartacus was no ordinary slave. He possessed a fierce intelligence and a burning desire for freedom, qualities that set him apart from his fellow gladiators. In 73 BC, He and about 70 of his comrades seized their chance. They broke out of the gladiatorial school, arming themselves with makeshift weapons, and fled to the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. There, they were joined by other escaped slaves, swelling their numbers and transforming their small band into a formidable force. What began as a desperate bid for freedom quickly escalated into a full-scale revolt. Spartacus and his followers raided Roman estates, freeing slaves and gathering supplies. As their numbers grew, so too did their ambitions. Spartacus envisioned more than just survival. He sought to lead his followers to freedom beyond Rome's borders, perhaps to their native lands. But the journey would not be easy, and Rome was not about to let such a challenge go unanswered. The Senate, alarmed by the growing strength of the rebellion, dispatched forces to crush it. Yet the Roman commanders underestimated Spartacus and his men. In battle after battle, the slave army defeated Roman legions, using guerrilla tactics and their intimate knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver their enemies. Spartacus proved to be a brilliant strategist, turning what should have been a ragtag band of fugitives into a disciplined and effective fighting force. The climax of this rebellion came in 72 BC, when Spartacus's forces, numbering in the tens of thousands, marched northward, possibly intending to cross the Alps and escape Rome's grasp. But for reasons still debated by historians, Spartacus turned back, leading his army southward once more. Perhaps he was persuaded by his followers, many of whom wished to continue their plundering of Italy. Perhaps he saw no real chance of survival beyond the Alps. Whatever the reason, this fateful decision sealed their doom. Rome, recognizing the severity of the threat, finally took decisive action. The Senate entrusted the command to Marcus Licinius Crassus, a wealthy and ambitious general who saw in this rebellion an opportunity to make a name for himself. Crassus, determined to end the revolt, pursued Spartacus with relentless vigor, employing harsh discipline to maintain control over his troops and utilizing every available resource to bring the slave army to heel. The final confrontation came in 71 BC, in the region of Lucania. Surrounded and outnumbered, Spartacus and his men fought with the desperation of those who knew they had nothing left to lose. In the end, the slave army was annihilated, and Spartacus himself fell in battle, his body never to be found. The survivors, captured by Crassus's forces, met a grim fate. 6,000 of them were crucified along the Appian Way, a gruesome warning to any who might consider following in Spartacus's footsteps. Yet despite its tragic end, the revolt of Spartacus left a lasting legacy. It exposed the deep divisions within Roman society and the brutal reality of slavery, a system that underpinned the wealth and power of the Republic, but also sowed the seeds of its decay. For the slaves who fought and died alongside Spartacus, the revolt was a desperate bid for freedom in a world that denied them even the most basic rights. For Rome, it was a reminder of the fragility of its social order and the ever-present threat of unrest among the oppressed. As I contemplate the story of Spartacus, I am struck by the enduring power of his struggle. Though he failed to overthrow the Roman Republic, Spartacus's rebellion remains a symbol of resistance against tyranny and injustice, a symbol that has resonated throughout history. His fight for freedom, though ultimately doomed, speaks to the universal human desire for dignity and autonomy, values that are as relevant today as they were in the days of Rome. Next, we shall turn our attention to the formation of the First Triumvirate in 60 BC, a political alliance that would alter the course of Roman history. This partnership between Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Crassus, forged in the pursuit of mutual gain, would ultimately lead to the collapse of the Republic and the rise of imperial rule. The story of the Triumvirate is a tale of ambition, betrayal, and the dangerous allure of power forces that would shape the fate of Rome and resonate far beyond its borders. The year 60 BC marked a turning point in the history of the Roman Republic, a moment when the ambitions of three powerful men converged to form an alliance that would shake the foundations of the state and set the stage for its eventual downfall. This alliance, known as the First Triumvirate, brought together Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, three individuals whose combined influence and resources made them the most formidable force in Rome. Yet it was an alliance born not out of friendship or shared ideals, but out of mutual need and ambition, an uneasy partnership that would ultimately unravel in the face of betrayal and rivalry. Julius Caesar, the youngest of the three, was a man of immense talent and boundless ambition. Born into a patrician family of declining fortune, Caesar had risen through the ranks of Roman politics with a combination of charm, political acumen, and sheer audacity. By 60 BC, he had already served as a military commander in Hispania and had achieved notable successes, but he knew that true power in Rome required more than just military glory. It required political alliances. Pompey the Great, on the other hand, was already a celebrated military leader by this time. Having conquered much of the eastern Mediterranean, including the mighty kingdom of Pontus and the remnants of the Seleucid Empire, Pompey was hailed as Rome's greatest general. However, despite his military achievements, Pompey found himself increasingly isolated in the political arena. His attempts to secure land for his veterans and ratify his eastern settlements had been thwarted by the Senate, which viewed him with suspicion and envy. In need of political support, Pompey saw in Caesar a valuable ally. The third member of the triumvirate, Marcus Licinius Crassus, was the wealthiest man in Roman oligarch, whose vast fortune had been amassed through shrewd investments, property speculation, and the purchase of prescribed citizens' estates during Sulla's reign. Despite his wealth, Crassus craved recognition and military glory to match that of Pompey. His campaign against Spartacus had earned him some measure of fame, but he was still overshadowed by Pompey's greater successes. Crassus, therefore, sought an opportunity to enhance his stature, and aligning with Caesar and Pompey offered him the chance to do so. The alliance was sealed in a secret meeting, where the three men agreed to support each other's ambitions. Caesar would secure the consulship for 59 BC, and in return, would push through legislation favorable to Pompey and Crassus. Pompey would have his eastern settlements ratified and his veterans settled on land, while Crassus would benefit from favorable financial legislation. Together, they would dominate Roman politics, bypassing the traditional republican institutions that had become obstacles to their power. Yet even as the triumvirate exerted its influence, the cracks in their alliance were already visible. The very nature of the partnership, built on mutual self-interest rather than genuine trust, meant that it was inherently unstable. Each man harbored his own ambitions, and as these ambitions grew, so too did the tensions between them. The first test of their alliance came during Caesar's consulship in 59 BC. Despite fierce opposition from the Senate, Caesar managed to pass the land reforms promised to Pompey, distributing public lands to veterans and the urban poor. He also secured a 5-year proconsular command in Gaul, where he would later achieve military fame. However, Caesar's aggressive tactics and disregard for senatorial authority alienated many in the Senate, sowing the seeds of future conflict. Meanwhile, Pompey and Crassus grew increasingly wary of each other. Pompey, whose military achievements had once made him the darling of Rome, now found himself overshadowed by Caesar's rising star. Crassus, for his part, envied Pompey's military glory and resented his dominance in the triumvirate. The fragile balance of power was beginning to shift, and with it, the stability of the Republic. As I reflect on the formation of the First Triumvirate, I am reminded of the dangers that arise when power is concentrated in the hands of a few. This alliance, though seemingly strong, was built on the foundation of ambition and rivalry forces that would ultimately tear it apart. The Triumvirate was a harbinger of things to come, a warning that the Republic was no longer governed by the rule of law, but by the will of powerful individuals. The story of the First Triumvirate is a tale of the corrupting influence of power and the fragility of political alliances. It is a reminder that when the pursuit of personal gain takes precedence over the common good, the consequences can be disastrous, not just for the individuals involved, but for the state as a whole. In the next part of our journey, we will witness the dramatic conclusion to this tale, the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, an event that would signal the final death knell of the Roman Republic. Caesar's rise to power, his accumulation of titles and honors, and his eventual murder at the hands of those who feared his growing tyranny are all part of a narrative that echoes through history as a warning against the dangers of unchecked ambition and the perils of absolute power. The Ides of March, Hoc Est 15. March 44 BC will forever be a date etched in the annals of history. It was on this day that Julius Caesar, the man who had risen from the ranks of Rome's political elite to become its most powerful leader, met his tragic end. His assassination, orchestrated by a group of senators who feared his growing power and the demise of the Republic, marked the culmination of a long and turbulent journey, a journey that would ultimately lead to the end of the Roman Republic and the dawn of an empire. Julius Caesar's rise to power had been nothing short of extraordinary. From his early days as a military commander in Gaul to his crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BC, a bold and unprecedented act that set Rome on the path to civil war, Caesar had demonstrated a rare combination of military genius, political acumen, and sheer determination. By the time he declared himself dictator for life, he had accumulated more power than any Roman since the days of the kings. But with great power came great danger. Caesar's accumulation of titles and honors, his centralization of authority, and his disregard for the traditional republican institutions bred resentment and fear among many of Rome's elite. They saw in him not just a leader, but a tyrant in the making, one who would end the Republic and establish a monarchy in its place. These fears were not unfounded. Caesar's actions, from his bypassing of the Senate to his reform of the calendar and expansion of citizenship, suggested that he sought to reshape Rome in his own image. As Caesar's power grew, so too did the conspiracy against him. Leading the charge were two men who had once been close to him, Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Brutus, a senator of noble lineage, was known for his integrity and commitment to the ideals of the Republic. Yet, he was also Caesar's protégé, a man whom Caesar had treated as a son. Cassius, on the other hand, was a seasoned military leader who had grown increasingly disillusioned with Caesar's dominance. Together, they rallied other senators to their cause, forming a plot that would forever change the course of Roman history. The conspirators chose the Senate House as the site of their deed, knowing that it was a place where Caesar would be vulnerable. On the morning of March 15th, as Caesar made his way to the Senate, he was warned of the danger that awaited him. A soothsayer famously told him to beware the Ides of March. Yet Caesar, either dismissive of the threat or confident in his invincibility, pressed on. As Caesar entered the Senate House, the conspirators surrounded him under the guise of paying their respects. Then at a signal they struck. The first blow came from Casca, and as Caesar attempted to defend himself, the other conspirators joined in, stabbing him repeatedly. According to legend, when Caesar saw Brutus among his attackers, he uttered the famous words, "Et tu, Brute," a phrase that has come to symbolize the ultimate betrayal. With these words, Caesar fell, his lifeblood staining the floor of the Senate. The assassination of Julius Caesar sent shockwaves throughout Rome. The conspirators, who believed they were saving the Republic, quickly discovered that they had unleashed chaos instead. Far from restoring the old order, Caesar's death plunged Rome into a new round of civil wars as his supporters sought to avenge him and seize power for themselves. The result was not the preservation of the Republic, but its final destruction. In the years that followed, Rome would see the rise of Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, later known as Augustus, who would defeat his rivals and establish himself as the first emperor of Rome in 27 BC, marking the beginning of the Roman Empire. The Republic, with its checks and balances, its traditions and institutions, was gone replaced by the autocratic rule of emperors. What the assassins had feared most, a return to monarchy, had come to pass, not in spite of their actions, but because of them. As I, Marcus Tullius Cicero, reflect on the assassination of Julius Caesar, I am filled with a deep sense of melancholy and foreboding. Caesar's death, while tragic in its own right, was but a symptom of a deeper malaise, the erosion of the values and principles that had once made Rome great. The Republic, which had stood for centuries as a beacon of liberty and governance, was undone not by external enemies, but by the ambitions and excesses of its own leaders. It is a stark reminder that the greatest threats to democracy often come from within. In conclusion, let us take heed of the lessons of history. The story of Rome's fall is not just a tale of ancient times, but a warning to all who cherish freedom and justice. Tyranny does not always announce itself with fanfare. It often comes disguised as the pursuit of order, stability, or even greatness. Yet once power is concentrated in the hands of a few, the path to despotism becomes all too easy. Thank you for watching. My channel, known as the Renaissance Spirit, is dedicated to the pursuits of a just, equitable, and humanitarian world, and how and why we all need to be the solution to the issues facing us today. Video topics encompass areas including news, analysis, history, politics, religion, personal development, society, culture, social and environmental justice, and other topics of liberal arts and sciences, including ancient Rome and the Roman Empire, which is a great comparison and contrast to the modern world. These topics are perfect for the true modern and egalitarian polymath, a person with an open mind and a thirst for truth in its many forms and disciplines, a journey through knowledge, reason, and time. The Renaissance ushered in a golden age and the pursuit of knowledge both lost to time and yet to be discovered. It gave birth to the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason and the Age of Humanism, embracing truth, knowledge, and an understanding and compassion for humanity and our shared history opens up the world to each of us individually and collectively, enhancing our stewardship of the earth and our relationships with one another. Living the Renaissance spirit means engaging with history not as a distant past, but as a living dialogue, constantly informing and enriching our present. The Renaissance spirit is a reminder of our dialogue with the future, our progeny and posterity, our legacy. Will we grant them a future free from the fear of climate change and tales of the end of democracy? Will they admonish us for our sins and omissions? Or will they remember us fondly as saviors of humanity and the natural world? Please take the quiz next to see if you're a Renaissance spirit, and stay tuned for Augustus, My Life as a Roman Emperor, told by Emperor Augustus himself, coming soon. In the meantime, check out our other videos in the series, including that of Julius Caesar. The Renaissance spirit is more than just a philosophy or style. It's a style for living, learning, growing, and thinking. Please subscribe, turn on notifications, and share. If you're looking to explore and experience life in the steps of the true masters of the Renaissance and free thinkers throughout our past, present, and future, then this is the channel for you. So, dear traveler through time, let us continue this journey together, finding inspiration in the stories of those who came before us and those who come next, forging a future guided by equality, wisdom, and compassion. Vive Renaissance spiritus, historia non et mortua, sed intellectus noster.
proud and grand, I watched you rise from the fearless sand. But now I see your pillars fall, betrayed by those who heed no call. Senators once wise, now blind with greed, turning from the common need. Liberty's light fades in the night as tyranny takes her flight. O Republic, my heart does weep, for in your ruins virtue sleep. Where once the voices of justice soared, now silence reigns, our hopes ignored. Rome, oh Rome, where have you gone? Your legacy now seems forlorn. May democracy never die, for shadows cast their darkened sky. O Respublica, cornel lacrimat, in ruinis tuis virtutis quiescunt. Ubi olim voces justitia volaverunt, nunc silentium regnat spes neglecta. Roma, o Roma, cor misti, heredatus tua nunc videtur deserta, neum quod democratia moriatur, quam visum recelum obscurent. What is Rome when lost tonight? Republic, my heart does weep, for in your ruins virtue sleep. Where once the voices of justice soared, now silence reigns, our hopes ignored. Rome, oh Rome, where have you gone? Your legacy now seems forlorn. May democracy never die, though shadows cast their darkened sky. I stood before the Senate's might, spoke of honor, truth, and light. Yet who am I against the tide, when power and greed do coincide? Is there no end to this dark night? Will Rome awaken to the light? O people of Rome, do you not see the chains that bind our tyranny? In you the power still resides, to turn the course, to stem the tides. But as I speak, my voice grows faint, drowned by those who feign restraint. Yet in these words my soul is free, crying out for what Rome should be. O Republic, my heart does weep, for in your ruins virtue sleep. Where once the voices of justice soared, now silence reigns, our hopes ignored. Rome, oh Rome, where have you gone? Your legacy now seems forlorn. May democracy never die, no shadows cast their darkened sky. I stood before the Senate's might, spoke of honor, truth,